Hi everybody, once again this is Zeri, Persian pen name on AO3, here to read you some stories. Let's see, I'm on week, goodness what is it, 19 since I started testosterone, so that's fun. I have actually noticed, well I didn't notice but a friend of mine noticed, a little bit of vocal change, so that's great. No, this is not going to fit today. Doop, doop, doop. I hadn't noticed anything, but they have a program that... What's the word I'm looking for? It tells you what the range is on various sounds, and they ran it on my first video, and then on one of my later videos, and there was a change. So, that's fun. Yes, hello Trixie. I can hear her outside there. I've got... My nails are a little bit thicker. My leg hair is a little bit darker. No other changes will be mentioned here. But I'm very excited. I'm digging it all so far. I'm impatient and I want I want to go talk to my doctor and be like, okay, so what if we, ramp it up a little, see how that's doing. But I know that I wanted to go slow, so I'm going slow, even though I have no patience at all, ever in my life. So, it's not going anywhere. It being me, in this case, or my body, whichever. But yeah, so that's a thing that's happened. Let's see, what's going on this week? I finished my... my sweater vest. It is not in the room with me, so you don't get any pictures. I picked back up some lace that I had started several years back. It's some Gossamer Weight. You know what? I'm gonna go grab that because I'm really proud of that one. Okay, and we're back. I figured while I was up, I might as well grab my sweater vest. So. Been wearing it to work, so I gotta turn it back in the correct direction. But yep, it's a sweater vest. It looks like a sweater vest. It's a little shorter than I would like. Honestly, I'm probably gonna make an order for another ball of this and then just extend it. While I'm at it, I'll grab another ball or two of the dark purple, and because I've got like a little less than 3 of that left, and that was 3 whole ones. So I know that the dark purple, what I've got left, wouldn't even make that much, so I'll grab just another 2 of that and 1 of the lilac, and then we'll be good, and I'll have a couple of sweater vests to wear when it's cold at work. Alright, so here is my lace. As I said, I'm very proud of this. It is tiny. Tiny, 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 tiny. Here is the ball. This is Gossamer Weight from Fleagle, the Gossamer Web on Etsy. Let's see, let's get some. These needles are zeros that I have sharpened with my glass nail file. Yeah, that's gonna be real nice. It takes me approximately... I was gonna say about 45 minutes to an hour to do a row, but that's on one of the plain rows. I haven't timed how long it takes on one of the pattern rows. Takes a long ass time. I'm feeling pretty good. I work on it at work because I have a lot of downtime there where I can do things with my hands. There we go, you can go sit over here. So I feel pretty good if during an 8-hour shift I can finish a row. And that's, because I'm getting interrupted and all of that. But I dyed this myself with onion skins back in the day. I got this yarn well over a decade ago. Fleagle was in contact with some spinning mills in China and was like, hey, I can have this made, this super crazy fine yarn in this particular cashmere, silk, merino combination that, that I want to do. But in order to do that, I need to make at least one big order to start with. Just, so they know that I'm not fucking around. And so she was giving out, she's like, hey, if you want to order a cone of it, which is a whole kilogram, which is fucking huge, I'll do it pretty much at cost. And so I ordered one of those, and it was like $80, which at the time was a lot for me. But that's enough, like I knew it was enough for at least 10 shawls that were more than 5,000 yards each. I dyed about 5,000 yards of this. I've got another hank of it somewhere. I haven't done all of it into a ball yet, just because it's going to be a while before I'm done with this part. So, the pattern is one that I wrote myself. I think that one was in 2019. Yeah, like right when lockdown was starting, maybe. That makes sense. I foster cats, as people who know me in person know. And at the time, I was doing a kitten ball, which is where, you drive. Someone starts from point A and drives to point B, and they hand off the cat to somebody at point B who drives to point C, who hands off the cat and keeps going and going and going. Kitten ball run, it's, if you're part of the Lazy, Stupid, and Godless group on Ravelry, you're familiar with them. But that was my longest kitten ball to date, which was me and my spouse driving from Texas to Utah. That was with two of our fosters who we'd had for over a year at that point. They were real sweet. If it wouldn't have put us at 7 cats at that point, I would have wanted to keep them. They were real sweet. That was Janthony and Zira, who were clearly named for good omens, but I don't care. Yeah, I'm a dork. So I wrote a pattern for that because I wanted to, and I had finished my Daisy shawl at that point, so I figured why not. This is the first layer of it. It is very long. Everything below the blue line I've finished. I just haven't, filled it all in there. But yeah, so speaking of my Daisy shawl, I went and checked on it today. It's been 2 weeks in the walnut dye bath. The stripe is still visible, but much less so. I'm going to put up the video on my Tumblr if it ever finishes loading. Yeah, it's working on it. I think maybe another week we'll do it. If not, we'll just keep it in there. It's just getting darker and darker and darker, and yeah, it's going, it's cooking. Eventually, the yarn will have taken up as much dye as it can, and the area that had taken up more dye in the initial round of dyeing will be the same color as the rest of it because it will have caught up. So that's that going on. Let's see what else has been doing. Not much. Like that and work has pretty much been it. It's definitely... Oh, it's spring. It's April. I need to go down into the pasture today because it might be dewberry season already. In which case, we've got acres and acres and acres of these wild dewberries coming up, and they are delicious. So that would also explain why the hogs have been coming around the house, because the area where we've been seeing them is where there's a lot of dewberry bushes, or vines, or what have you. Anyway, so that'll probably be my afternoon. Remember to wear sunscreen if you're going around outside. I've got a big-ass pasture hat that's... You can't see it, maybe in a little bit in the reflection, but it's a full-on glam kitchen levels of giant fuck-off hat that I wear into the pasture, and I look ridiculous, and I love it. So yeah, that's that. But anyway, we're already 10 minutes into this, and I haven't done anything by way of a story. So this week, it will be Love's Proper Exercise by Moonlighten. This is another original work. I've been trying to, do more of those. The relationships are rich introverted gentleman / his charming outgoing male friend who's refused every past suitor. Pseudo-Regency era historical fantasy. It was from Shipoween 2019 for Bonster. So, let's see. I haven't actually read this one all the way down. I read it, enough down to make sure that I liked it. And then, because I enjoy reading things blind. So, I read it down and I was like, okay, yeah. The prose is good, the voice is good, I'm liking how it's going, so. I'm probably not going to do much by way of accents on this because my accents are terrible. So let's see. Love's Proper Exercise by Moonlighten. There is magic held deep within the earth, Edward says, and it is released into the air whenever a farmer tills their land or the ground itself shifts beneath our feet. A person can then draw it into themselves with a breath and, if they are sensitive to his influence, it can change them. One might think of it as a close cousin to miasma, just as potent, just as transformative, but its power is constructive rather than destructive. His companion looks intrigued for the first time since Lady Harding introduced them. "Are you a practitioner of the magical arts, sir?" he asks. "Alas, no," Edward says. "Mine is only an academic interest. I study magic and endeavor to write about it." "A novelist, then?" His companion sounds eager still, but again Edward must disappoint him. He shakes his head. "I am penning a scholarly work on the natural philosophy of magic." Damn, that sounds rad. The spark of interest that had briefly brightened the young man's pale blue eyes dims, and he seeks solace in his wine-glass. He stares intently at its contents, as though some great wisdom or fantastical truth might be uncovered from their depths if he looks hard enough. Whilst the most accomplished of divinators can prognosticate the future in wine, Edward has learned from his research that tea leaves provide the clearest picture of it to the gifted amateur. A fascinating tidbit, and one which Edward intends on sharing with his companion, but as soon as he opens his mouth to speak, the young man cuts him off with, "It appears I am in need of more wine. If you'll excuse me, sir." He doesn't wait for Edward to make any reply before scurrying away with his half-full glass to rejoin the crowds milling around the margins of the ballroom. Edward watches him go with some disappointment, but even greater self-recrimination. Like any skill, the art of conversation with strangers is one which atrophies with disuse. Edward has not picked up an oar since he graduated university, and would never dream of entering a boat race on the morrow, and yet here he is, attending one of Lady Harding's private balls after a year spent avoiding evening engagements entirely. Just as he would need to scull around a pond a time or two in order for his muscles to relearn the push and pull rhythm of rowing, he should perhaps have first attended a dinner or a card party to reacquaint himself with the back-and-forth rhythm of small talk, before subjecting himself to this particular trial by fire of sociability. Still, it's too late for regrets. No matter how seductive the thought of his own quiet fireside might be, it would be unconscionably rude to succumb to it this early in the evening, without the excuse of a sudden illness, or at least the fiction of one believable enough to pass muster with the shrewd and perceptive Lady Harding. As Edward knows himself to be far from a compelling actor, he must endure. He sips on his wine and tries to look welcoming and at ease with his surroundings, but his performance is clearly one of his less convincing efforts, as no one approaches him. The odd lady and gentleman do look towards him in passing, but only in passing, giving him no more than a skimmed glance before dismissing him from their minds and moving on. except for one man. Pardon. Except for one man. A bow-legged, sinewy man dressed in regimentals, who meets Edward's gaze boldly and does not look away. His gaze is so intent, so focused, that Edward feels pierced to the bone by it and thusly pinned in place, like a preserved butterfly mounted on an entomologist's corkboard. His skin prickles with heat, his throat runs dry, but he cannot move, not when the man walks towards him with the steady, prowling gait of a predator, or even when he steps up, crowded so uncomfortably close that Edward can smell the Madeira on his breath. "Mr. Blackmore," he says, sounding so sure of himself that it's more of a statement than a question. Edward hadn't expected anyone to know him here except for Lady Harding, so the man's certainty both shocks and discombobulates him. "Yes, sir," he says apprehensively. The man's mouth splits into a delighted grin. "I thought it was you." "You have the advantage of me, sir," Edward has to admit, loath as he is to claim ignorance in the face of such affability. "I'm afraid I don't recall your name." If the man is wounded at all, he takes pains not to show it. His laughter booms loud and hearty. "I'm Nicholas Elkins, Colonel Elkins now," he says. "We were at school together." The name rings no more bells than his face had done. Edward says, playing for time as he desperately tries to think of a polite way of confessing that Elkins is apparently so forgettable that he didn't retain a single memory of him over the course of 8 years. Thankfully, Colonel Elkins steps into the breach to save him. "I'm not surprised you didn't recognize me," he says, still smiling. "You always did have your nose stuck in a book. Never looked up. You still do that, do you? Read?" The last word is pronounced with a tone of withering scorn, as though it's some unsavory, youthful habit Edward really should have grown out of. "Well, yes," Edward says, feeling oddly ashamed of himself. "I was just saying to my wife that you didn't look to have changed a bit, and it seems I was right. Aside from growing taller and perhaps a little plumper around the middle." Edward supposes he hasn't altered much since his school days. The better part of his life is still given over to his books, and he's still floating around at the periphery of other people's lives, watching them from the outside and never quite having the courage or the determination to join in. It would be a disquieting realization to strike anywhere, but especially so here, in a heaving ballroom, when Edward has no opportunity to be alone with it, and turn it over in his mind at his leisure until he comes to understand what it means to him. In an effort to disguise his uneasiness, he forces a smile to his lips and jokes weakly, "Well, I do wear spectacles now." "That'll be all that reading." Colonel Elkins laughs again and delivers a slap to Edward's back so resounding that he stumbles forward a step, almost losing his grip on his wineglass in the process. A splash of wine overflows the glass's rim and spatters Edward's breeches, the dark ruddy stain spreading quickly across the light fabric. Colonel Elkins doesn't seem to notice, and after giving a swiftly bobbed bow of farewell, marches militarily off in the direction from which he had come, presumably to meet up with his wife in order to inform her that Edward is indeed still just as peculiar as he had been as a child. Left to his own devices again, Edward dabs at his damp breeches with his handkerchief, but only succeeds in staining that, too. The soiled handkerchief is at least simply dealt with, shoved into the hidden inside pocket of his tailcoat, but his sole recourse where the breeches are concerned would be finding a corner dark enough to disguise his shame, and remaining there for the rest of the night. Though the idea is a tempting one, Edward resists its allure, as he had promised Mamma that he would not hide himself away as his usual habit during balls. He will stand as proud as can reasonably be expected of a man with besmirched breeches. Ooh, that's a good phrase. He will stand as proud as can be reasonably expected of a man with besmirched breeches, and be at ease, be approachable, once more. He fares no better at this second attempt than he did at the first. He is overlooked, ignored, and has just about resigned himself to a lonely night of watching other people dance, and mentally critiquing their form, when he notices a familiar figure on the opposite side of the ballroom. Lord Hugh Lightholder, adept mage, bon vivant, and the closest Edward can claim to a friend nowadays. At this distance, Edward can admire him in a way he never dares to when they are face to face, letting his eyes trace the lines of Hugh's well-turned calves, trim waist, and sharp profile as he moves through the crowd with a sinuous grace, pausing only to drop a word into this lady's ear, or brush a glancing touch against that gentleman's arm. They all flush and smile at him, and something ugly and unseemly stirs in Edward's guts, though he doesn't know himself whether his jealousy has been awakened by Hugh himself, for how effortlessly he comports himself in company, or by those he is giving his attentions to. Edward isn't quite quick enough in looking away when Hugh circulates towards his side of the room, and he accidentally catches Hugh's eye. Hugh nods in acknowledgement, but doesn't extend a formal greeting, and Edward does not expect him to. In life, Hugh's father was Edward's papa's dearest friend, and since his untimely passing, Hugh has visited the Blackmore estate once a week to share an insipid meal of the bland pap that is all Edward's papa can stomach these days. And then, once Papa and Mamma have taken to their beds, he humors Edward's thirst for his company by joining him in his study. Within it, he lights 2 cigars with a sparkling flick of his fingers which still makes Edward's heart flutter even after so many years of their same routine. And they drink port and talk of Edward's research and Hugh's misadventures until the fire and candles burn low. Those visits are the highlight of Edward's otherwise uneventful weeks, but he's always suspected that they are nothing more than a duty to Hugh, performed out of respect for his father's memory. It comes as a great surprise, therefore, when Hugh brushes aside the clinging hand of an exceedingly handsome young gentleman and tells him, "I've seen a friend I really must talk to." Perhaps it had been merely an excuse to escape the gentleman's clutches, which are most persistent, as he goes so far as to make another grab for Hugh as he's walking away. But Edward finds he doesn't much care either way. Hugh is so much more striking up close, his breeches and stockings fitted as tight as a second skin, his teeth, his hazel eyes, and chestnut hair all gleaming. Even his hands look elegant somehow, despite him not wearing the fine white cotton gloves of the other ball-goers, but a pair made from heavy black leather, the sort all mages favor, due to hide the scarring of their palms. He does not lay one of those black-clad hands on Edward's arm, as Edward had seen him do with the other gentleman he talked to, but instead offers a deep bow. "Edward," he says, his voice pitched low and sounding so intimate that it makes Edward shiver, even though he knows that Hugh talks to everyone in the same fashion, even Edward's cantankerous old papa. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you," Edward says. If he had, he wouldn't have accepted Lady Harding's invitation. Talking to Hugh often leaves him flustered, which is humiliating enough in the safety and privacy of his own home, with no one else there to bear witness to his blushes. "I thought you were staying in the countryside with friends." "I was," Hugh says, "but I had obligations in town that necessitated my return." "Ah, yes, dinner with Mamma and Papa," Edward suggests, teasing. "You've already missed one. I'm sure you wouldn't want to miss another." "Our dinners are a pleasure, not an obligation." The words are spoken so smoothly that Edward could almost believe they were the truth, and the very blush he had been wanting to avoid rises to his cheeks. "My father will be happy to see you," he says, staunchly disregarding his own feelings on the matter, as his color will only heighten yet further if he does not. Hugh inclines his head to accept the point, and they both lapse into silence for a moment, wherein Hugh looks Edward over, thoroughly and evaluative. His eyes widen slightly when he notices the stain on Edward's breeches, but he spares him the embarrassment of mentioning it, instead saying, "I understand Lady Harding has despaired of you ever accepting one of her invitations. Apparently you are never short of a reason to refuse them. Either your mamma will have taken ill, your papa will be indisposed, or you will have conceived of a sudden and urgent need to rearrange your coin collection by date of minting rather than denomination." "Ass is right and proper," Edward says, as he always says. They have argued about the same subject many times, typically at the end of the night, when they both have enough port inside them, that such trifling affairs seem to be of the utmost importance. And I fear I may never be able to persuade you otherwise. Hugh smiles just a little, his mouth curling up at one corner. A ball is hardly a fitting venue to discuss such serious topics, though, and we should postpone our debate to another time. I would say that we should speak of dancing, but I haven't seen you dance once yet. Why did you come here tonight, Edward? The question sounds more concerned than accusatory. You've always given me to believe you detest these sorts of entertainments. I do, but... Oh, thank you, phone. I do, but one cannot always be sitting at home, no matter how comfortable it might be, Edward says. It's high time for me to socialize more, meet new people. I sense your mamma's hand in this, Hugh says. Yes, she did encourage it. She says that I ought to think about marrying, and sooner rather than later. And you're considering it? I'm not just considering it. I've made up my mind on the matter. Edward nods firmly. She's right. Hugh blinks at him, slow and bewildered. I thought you weren't interested in that sort of thing either, he says. I told you that? Well, not in so many words, Hugh concedes, but you intimated, or maybe I assumed. When they were younger, Edward supposed that he had talked very romantically about devoting himself to his studies and how he could be satisfied even if his books were his only companions, but that future appears increasingly unattractive the closer he comes to living in it. His sister has recently married and moved to the other end of the country, beyond the reach of easy travel, and his few friends have either done the same or else are so wrapped in their own private concerns that they have little time to spare him any more. As Mamma and Papa tire more easily now, and are retiring to bed earlier and earlier, Edward's lonely evenings feel to stretch impossibly long, no matter how deeply he immerses himself in his research. He does not miss attending parties and balls, but he does often find himself wishing that he had someone to share the quiet with, both of them working on their own pursuits, and both content just to know that the other is close at hand. And then, as night drew in, to share a snifter and a conversation with in front of the fire, whiling away the dark hours before bed. And from there... From there lies an avenue of thought that wends in a direction unbecoming for traveling along in public, and most especially in the presence of his current companion. With practice ease, Edward stops himself from setting so much as a mental foot upon it. Matrimony does have its appeals, he says. I suppose so, Hugh says, somewhat dubiously to Edward's ear, but then he has never professed to be a devotee of the institution himself. Hugh's father used to say that Hugh received marriage proposals as frequently as he did haircuts, but to Edward's knowledge he has turned down every one. His romances are far more fleeting affairs, and by all accounts, even greater in number. Edward's father calls him a libertine, though never to Hugh's face. So, I suppose you'll be looking for a young lady or gentleman who's clever, interested in magic, and perhaps even a mage, Hugh says. Handsome goes without saying. As fond of the country as they are of town, and proficient at the pianoforte, as I know it gives you great pleasure to have music in the evenings when you're not working on your book. Maybe titled, but certainly in possession of a fortune in proportion to your own. Hugh continues in the same vein for some time, spinning the lists of qualities and accomplishments of Edward's imagined suitor out into absurdity. If a person of such exalted talents did actually exist, they would have far better marriage prospects than Edward. I would be searching forever if those were my requirements, Edward says, interrupting Hugh in mid-flow. They would just have to be kind, and not mind listening to me ramble on about my work every once in a while. Well, then you'd be selling yourself very cheaply, my friend, Hugh says, giving Edward a doleful look. Now, I'm acquainted with many people here tonight, and though they are not all abundant in either kindness or patience, I can think of a couple who might suit. If you'll excuse me, he bows to Edward again, I shall go and inquire as to whether I can introduce them to you. At supper, Edward exchanges a few stilted words about the weather with the lady sat to his left at the table, but their nascent bid towards conversation is cut short by the arrival of a much more interesting gentleman who sits down on her other side and monopolizes her attention in an instant. Edward concentrates on his pigeon pie until his attention is diverted in turn by Hugh, who hurls himself down in the free seat to Edward's right so violently that it's a wonder that the chair doesn't collapse beneath him. He ignores Edward's greeting and, in a show of poor manners that Edward has never seen him display before, reaches out over the laden table to help himself to a small sprig of grapes from the silver bowl set at its center. He pops one of the fruits into his mouth and then bites down on it hard. The muscles of his jaw clench tight as he grinds his teeth together, his eyebrows drawn low in a disgruntled frown, and he looks very much like he is chewing on a mouthful of grit. Nevertheless, he eats 2 more grapes in quick succession, slouching over the plate a waiting servant belatedly places in front of him. The sharp arc of his hunched shoulder blades distorts the otherwise clean lines of his tailcoat, and puts Edward in mind of a defensive hedgehog, rolled up tight and presenting its spines. Hugh's mood is normally sanguine, but on those rare occasions that his temper has frayed when they pass time together, Edward has sought to offer him comfort by placing a hand on his back. Now that he is holding himself so stiffly, Edward fears irrationally that Hugh's entire body might shatter into pieces if he were to touch him, so he can only ask, quietly and unobtrusively so as not to startle him, "Are you all right, Hugh?" "What?" Hugh snaps, and then immediately looks guilty. "I'm sorry, Yes, I'm fine, He sighs heavily. "How are you? How goes your quest? Have you danced with anyone yet?" Sadly not," Edward says, though in truth his search for potential partners has become even more desultory now that he knows Hugh is present. Pardon. He has been looking for him instead, hoping to catch a glimpse of him amongst the thronged masses of strangers in the ballroom, though that search has been as much in vain as the other. "And you? Have you managed to track down any of those kind, patient people you wanted to introduce to me?" "They've proved elusive so far," Hugh says with a strange twist to his lip that Edward finds impossible to interpret. Hugh hurls the denuded grape stem to his plate and then staggers to his feet in such an ungainly and harried a manner that he has to grab hold of the edge of the table to keep himself from overbalancing. Edward has never seen him lose so much of his natural poise before, even when he's so stewed that he's lost the power of coherent speech. Unthinking, Edward reaches out to steady him, but Hugh steps sideways away from his hand. "And I'm not likely to find any of them in here," Hugh continues, "so." He stalks out of the dining room and into the ballroom proper, leaving his last word hanging suspended, naked of any of the customary apologies or farewells he would normally deliver in order to soften his departure. Incivility is also uncharacteristic of him, and when taken together with his scowls and his clumsiness, it suggests he is more seriously out of sorts than Edward has ever known him to be. He fears that Hugh might be unwell, and his anxiety over that prospect robs him of the enjoyment he would otherwise have felt in eating the rest of his really quite excellent pigeon pie. After finishing his unsatisfactory supper, Edward suffers through another abortive and equally unsatisfactory attempt at endearing himself to a pleasant lady that Lady Harding has introduced him to, upon finding him standing alone and unpartnered, and then his will to continue subjecting himself to the entire futile exercise abruptly gives out. He is more exhausted than the hour can possibly account for, bone-weary in a way he has not experienced since his days as a rowing blue, and fit for nothing more than sitting quietly on one of the chairs arrayed in the back of the ballroom. There situated, he checks his pocket watch and is horrified to discover it is even earlier than he had anticipated. 1 full hour remaining until the time he had ordered his carriage to arrive. Playing cards does not appeal, so there's nothing to be done but watch the crowds again, the distracting shimmer of colorful swirling dresses and dazzling glint of jewels and buffed brass buttons reflecting the candlelight. He does not see Hugh among their number, not for 10, 20, approaching 30 minutes, and his earlier anxiety resurfaces. If Hugh truly is ill, then he might have sought peace and quiet in the gardens, or some little used room, and passed out beyond the notice of anyone. Edward is on the verge of setting out in search for him when the man himself reappears, squeezing past a large group of braying militiamen gathered only a few feet away. He looks decidedly rumpled, his cravat askew and the tails of his coat deeply creased. It smells of cigar smoke and rather more strongly of brandy. His hair is standing up in wild tufts above his ears, as though he's been running his hands through it or tugging on it compulsively for some time. Or someone else has. The thought is a fleeting one, and Edward dismisses it determinedly. It is no business of his if they have, and dwelling on such possibilities only leads him towards melancholy anyway. He's had quite enough of that for one night as it is. "Still no partner?" Hugh says, gesturing towards the empty chairs to either side of Edward. "No," Edward says, "but perhaps I'll have better luck at my next ball." Which will be next year at the earliest, more than likely. It will take him at least that long to recover from this one, and shore up his defenses for attending another. "I assume your carriage will be bearing you away at the stroke of midnight, just as it used to," Hugh says. After receiving Edward's confirmatory nod, he adds, "Well, you can't leave a ball without having danced even once." He holds out his hand, palm flat and upraised. "Would you do me the honor of dancing the next with me?" On the surface it's a kind offer, but Edward is suspicious of it. They had attended the same balls many times in their younger years, and Hugh has never once asked Edward to dance before, nor given any indication that he might be inclined to do so, even though Edward was never burdened by an overabundance of potential partners at any of them. His luck was never as poor then as it has been tonight, though, and Edward presumes that Hugh's question was inspired by pity. He should probably take umbrage at that and refuse him, but he has dreamt of this moment too often for injuries to his pride to hold any sway. He places his hand in Hugh's, and Hugh uses it to pull him to his feet, but then swiftly drops it again. When they move across the ballroom, he maintains a hand's breadth of distance between them, so that their arms do not brush together as they walk. Edward takes no insult from this behavior, as it has always been this way. Barring the handshakes that begin and end their weekly dinner events, Hugh seldom touches him. So seldom, in fact, that Edward remembers each time distinctly, the memories still vivid and rich in detail, due to having been revisited so often over the years since they occurred. A press of Hugh's fingertips to the inside of his wrist when Edward took ill after too many sleepless nights in a row spent writing. A congratulatory clasp to the back of his neck when his first book was published. A brief embrace on the day of Hugh's father's funeral service. Edward has long suspected that Hugh has guessed the depths of his feeling, and, not wanting to encourage them, avoids all unnecessary physical contact as a consequence. So he is astonished when they reach the dance floor, and sees that the couples already gathered there are standing in the closed position. "The next will be a waltz," he says to Hugh, thinking he must have overlooked the telltale postures of the other dancers somehow. The waltz had been considered quite scandalous when Edward was a boy, unfit for decent society, and Papa had forbidden Edward's dance master from teaching him the steps. Edward had had to learn them at university, far from Papa's censorious eye. His teacher then had been a young lady with whom the waltz had been the least scandalous of the acts they had practiced together. It is still a much more intimate dance than the quadrille or cotillion. Too intimate, Edward would have thought, for a man who is so assiduous about keeping his distance from him at all other times. But Hugh says, "I know," which Edward can scarcely credit. Nonetheless, that careful hand's breadth between them remains, until the first note of the waltz sounds, whereupon Hugh clutches hold of Edward's right hand with his left, snakes his other arm around Edward's waist, and pulls him so closely against his chest that Edward can feel his heart pounding out a frenzied rhythm against the cage of his ribs. Edward's own heart speeds up to match it. Hugh's hands tighten, his fingers clawing into Edward's knuckle and the bony jut of his right hip, and power streams from them. Hugh's magic, flowing through Edward's body in pulsing waves, and the thrill of it, of Hugh's closeness, is intoxicating. Everything else fades away, save for the harsh sound of Hugh's breathing, The music, the chatter of voices, even the ballroom itself, which dissolves into a muddied, featureless blur. Disoriented, Edward can only follow where Hugh leads him, first in several stately circuits around the dance floor, and from there to the dark corner in which Edward had considered hiding himself following his misadventure with Colonel Elkins. In the shadows, Hugh presses a kiss to the back of Edward's hand. It's not a simple peck of gratitude. His lips linger, and they're scalding. His eyes, when he lifts them to Edward's, are even hotter, burning with a question. Edward knows then that he could have Hugh to his bed with a single word. Every heated part of him aches for it, but he hesitates, because he also knows that it would likely be for no more than a single night. He would not call Hugh a libertine, but his affections have always been fickle and short-lived, and Edward would not be content with one night, or even 100. He would always yearn for something greater than that small taste, and doubtless ruin himself for anyone else, even more so than he already has been. Reluctantly, he steps back. "I'm not interested in a fling, Hugh," he says. "I'm looking for a partner in my life." "Well," Hugh says, and he smiles, wide and beaming and impossibly bright. "This time, I think I am too." The end. So, this one was lovely. I like it very much. I am not good at Regency stuff. Like, my spouse is running a Regency era D&D game right now, and I was invited, but it's like, I can't write that. I can't, I can't make that, I can't make my brain go that subtly and poetically. I love it, but I can't reproduce it. So, I really like this fic. I'm gonna read more by this author. Yes, Moonlighten. I'm gonna go Ooh, 32 original works. Nice. Alright, so that has been this week's story. I hope you all liked it. I hope you all go and read more by this person. It's real good. Until then, I will see you next week. Have fun, be good, make good trouble, make good life choices. Or at least, fun ones. Alrighty, I'll see you guys later.